Right, you're ready to inspire people and change the world with an original oratory speech. Now, what do? First thing is to brace yourself, because the next step of developing an OO topic is definitely one of the most challenging aspects of original oratory. Here are the best tips I've found for developing a strong OO topic. Many of these tips actually overlap, so please excuse any redundancies, but I've tried to make it as clear as possible. These tips are the most common feedback I give students year after year in terms of developing an OO topic. The first one is about making sure you have a mindset, not a problem, as your topic. A strong OO topic has a specific mindset or a set of values that cause societal problems. One of the biggest mistakes I see when students try to pick an OO topic is that they confuse a societal problem for an actual mindset. You got to think of the mindset as the cause and the problem as the effect. If you start with the effect, something like racism or sexism or homophobia, it's actually going to be a very dry and boring speech because almost everybody in the audience agrees that those things are bad. So let's look at some examples. So mindsets are things that are often complete sentences, such as, we've become too focused on instant gratification. Notice that idea of instant gratification needing to fulfill our desires instantly is an actual mindset. Or we yearn for simplicity. We don't want complexity in our existence. We want something very simple to make sense of our universe. Another one is we are told we need to find some grand meaning for our lives. You could notice that is a mindset, right? I need to find my life's purpose, my life's meaning. That isn't necessarily a problem in and of itself. Now, of course, these speeches are going to show that each of these mindsets cause specific societal problems, but in and of themselves, these statements don't seem problematic, and that's often a sign that you found a mindset. A final one is we obsess with telling stories to make sense of the complexities of the world. That's J.J. Kapoor's speech. Again, notice he doesn't start off with saying, we discriminate against those who look different from us, or we reduce the complexities of people and assume that they are something that they're not. Instead, he just starts with the simple mindset that we obsess with telling stories. We are storytelling creatures. That's part of our DNA, and that's a mindset that we all have. Now let's contrast those mindsets with actual societal problems. Societal problems oftentimes cause very concrete harms, like racism or sexism or homophobia. Some of them may not cause direct harms that are as quantifiable, but they still nevertheless are causing issues in society, such as procrastination or political partisanship or being too stressed. And then there's other problems like substance abuse or depression rates and suicide and other forms of mental illness. Notice all of those are not mindsets. They are problems that are oftentimes caused by specific mindsets. This distinction is incredibly important to creating a unique and engaging topic. Otherwise, your topic will just sound boring and generic. If you tell an audience that we should be less racist, or we should be less sexist, or we should procrastinate less, or we should be less partisan, then everybody will immediately be bored because they already agree with you. In fact, worst case, they might think you are being condescending by telling them something so obvious. So finding mindsets is certainly harder than finding problems. It requires you to dig a little bit deeper and to find root causes that do not seem immediately intuitive, right? Saying that our yearning for simplicity causes serious problems in society isn't immediately evident. Or saying that because we're told we need to find some grand meaning in our lives that has led to things like the rise of hate groups, again, isn't immediately obvious. But if you just say, hey, we should stop joining hate groups, that's going to be a boring speech. So that's the first important distinction, the first important tip I have for you. Second, make sure that your topic is unexpected. Another way of putting this is don't be obvious. Surprise your audience. And hopefully you can see how this overlaps with the first point I just made. If you have an original mindset, then obviously it's going to be surprising. It's going to be unexpected. And I think in general, the best topics articulate mindsets that do not intuitively or obviously seem bad. In fact, they should seem like things that we reasonably all do, and most of the audience at first should think, oh, we do this for good reason. If you tell an audience that we yearn for simplicity in our lives or that we obsess over trying to tell stories about the world, most people will not immediately think that those mindsets cause some of the most egregious issues in our society. The power of a speech comes from surprising your audience and persuading them that these seemingly innocent mindsets actually lead to quite large problems. So some examples is if you came up and said, we need to be more understanding, or you said, we need to be less judgmental. Obviously, that would be an incredibly obvious mindset. At least those two examples I just gave are mindsets as opposed to problems, right? We need to be more understanding. At least that's getting at some sort of mindset that right now we are not very understanding. But I hope you can see that that is a very obvious mindset. That's not something that's going to surprise anybody. And a 10-minute speech telling your audience that they need to be more understanding isn't going to be very entertaining. If you were to stand up and say, we need to be less angry. Of course, the mindset would be, right now, we are too quick to be angry, or we should be less discriminatory. These are the types of topics that are just going to be very bland and boring. Notice how all of those just seem so obvious on face why they're bad, as opposed to a good, unexpected mindset, like we obsess over trying to tell stories, or we become focused on simplicity. Those types of mindsets are not obvious in terms of why they cause problems, and so the speech itself will be a lot more interesting. Third is about establishing common ground. Another way to think about this is making sure your topic is relevant to everybody in the audience. And so you need to establish common ground between you and your audience so that you're not just talking about things that are only relevant to teenagers or a very specific population. Many of the problems that you will initially think of, especially as a freshman in high school, aren't actually world problems. They're 14-year-old problems. And I will promise you the two I get most often from rhetoric freshmen are, first, peer pressure, and second, social media being bad. Let me tell you right off the bat, those are not good topics. And here's why. They just don't affect adults in the way that they affect teenagers. So these topics will just be boring to them because they really don't apply. Adults aren't really influenced by peer pressure in the way that kids are. I understand that for teenagers, you could probably develop some devastating harms in terms of the way that peer pressure can force kids into doing things that are probably bad. But if you really try to think about peer pressure on the adult level, let me just tell you, adults don't really care about the pressures of social groups in the way that kids do. So they don't feel as pressured into doing bad things. Yes, maybe at times they feel influenced to act slightly different than they normally would if they were just on their own, but that isn't causing vast societal harms. Likewise, in terms of social media, yes, adults might spend some time on social media. We probably all have that one grandparent who spends more time on Facebook than an entire classroom of 14-year-olds combined. But it's not devastating adults as much as it might be teenagers in terms of views of their own self-image, in terms of anxieties about how they are appearing in terms of others. They aren't stressing about Snapchat streaks or IG stories in the way that you might. So ultimately, the question you should always ask yourself when selecting a topic is, does this mindset affect average everyday adults like my mom or dad? Or does this only affect other freshman high school students or just high school students more broadly? You need to establish a common ground between yourself and your audience in terms of your topic. And so the first thing you need to think of is, how does this affect average people across society as opposed to how does this affect me and my friends? Fourth, you need to make sure that your mindset actually is pervasive. That it doesn't just affect some small subset, but that it's widespread. It pervades many different aspects of our society and culture and actions. Let's give an example of a bad topic, and again, hopefully you can see the overlap between the last point and this point, peer pressure. Yes, this affects middle school and high school students, but who else does it affect? How is it pervasive in other parts of our society? Yeah, if you're noticing a trend, I hate the peer pressure topic for OO, so please don't even waste my time by presenting it. Every year, even with varsity students, I get topic proposals, and when I ask these students a basic question, how does this affect average Americans or everyday adults? How would this affect your mom and dad? I oftentimes get crickets. And that's a sign that this mindset really probably isn't pervasive across society, but just applies to a very specific population. And oftentimes what I find with this point about your topic needing to be pervasive is that students start by thinking of the harms or the problems that they want to solve, and they don't think about how the mindset is embodied by people across society. Because ultimately, OO is about mindsets or a set of values that people have. And so what you need to think about is how that mindset is embodied in average, everyday people, and how in certain examples that mindset is brought to extremes that causes devastating harms. But regardless, the first thing you need to do in an OO is to prove to the judge that this mindset is widespread and it's something that they probably do as well without even realizing that it's bad. Now, of course, they're probably not doing it to the extreme that you're going to talk about in many instances, but it's really important to prove that this mindset is actually pervasive. Otherwise, the speech is going to feel far too narrow. My fifth piece of advice is about severity. You need to make sure, or you need to prove, the problems caused by the mindset are severe. So if my last point was about showing that the problems are widespread, that the mindset is widespread, that many people, it pervades the way many people think. This point is about showing that that mindset, once it manifests itself into problems, that those problems are severe, they are serious, they are heavy, they cause big problems. So let's talk about an example of a problem that is pervasive but might not be severe. You might be able to prove a mindset is pervasive, like we all spend too much time on our phones, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the problem is serious. Now, of course, you might be able to prove that there are serious problems here, but on face, just saying that people spend too much time on phones, yeah, that's probably a problem. It probably gets in the way of some relationships, but I don't think that's necessarily leading to widespread ruining of lives. And I think that's a good way to think about severity. Severity is about how does this mindset ruin lives? Another example would be everyone conforming to social norms too much, which prevents them from following their passions. Okay, so what? I mean, I get it. That's kind of sad, right? That somebody doesn't end up following their passion for music because they've been told they want to be a doctor. But what's the impact to that? How is that ruining lives? How is this seriously and negatively affecting society? Why is this a severe impact? Those are the types of questions you need to ask. And just so you know, all of those examples I've given so far, there are definitely worlds where they could probably be transformed into stellar topics that articulate severe problems, but in their current form as I've articulated them, I don't think they've been phrased in a way where they have good, big, weighty problems. Sixth, diversity. You want examples of the problems or the way in which the mindset is embodied that range from very lighthearted to much more serious and dramatic. So it's important that you don't just have one serious, weighty harm in your speech, but you actually have a number of issues that are caused by the mindset that range from more lighthearted, i.e. the way that adults like your mom and dad might embody these things, to much more serious versions, like when somebody is compelled to violence because of the mindset. And you'll notice in the speeches that you've watched, there's usually a crescendo. They start with more humorous examples of the way in which this mindset started and the way in which it's embodied and the way that it might play out in certain situations. And then they'll usually build to a very serious and dramatic point. And I think it's important to have that range. Often politics or pop culture, especially celebrities, can provide more humorous examples. And then you can escalate and eventually build to much more serious harms like hate crimes. So those are the most important tips I have about developing an original oratory topic. But unfortunately, those tips don't really help you in terms of finding a topic. And this is the hardest part of an OO. Even if you abstractly understand all of the criteria that I just articulated, it can still be very hard to find an OO. And that's why this is the hardest step. It's not as simple as just Googling major problems in society and immediately coming across a mindset. If you just type in problematic mindsets, you're not going to find really what you're looking for. That's a term of art that we're using in this class to describe original oratory. It's not something that will immediately yield great search results. So it's challenging because most articles talk about concrete problems, not abstract mindsets. Most people don't really want to do that level of depth and analysis in terms of the root causes of specific mindsets. They typically just want to get the news of daily events reported to them or hear about politics. So here's my advice in terms of researching a good topic. And the first major thing you have to remember is you have to be patient. It's very hard to find an OO topic quickly, and unlike other speech events, an OO topic typically changes and develops throughout the entire speech writing process, and that's fine. It is oftentimes much more an art than a science, and it takes time to develop a good one. So if in this first week you are not totally happy with where your OO topic is, that's fine. This is a very rushed process, especially within the rhetoric class. And so you just need to have patience and understand that as you continue to research more and more over the coming weeks, you articulate a better topic. It's often actually one of the last things that comes into place. Oftentimes students figure out what types of problems and issues they want to talk about, and it takes more time to develop really, or to perfect the articulation of the mindset that is the root cause of that. So, Here's my advice on how to research a good topic. First, start by brainstorming what societal problems you care about and the personal stories you want to tell. I think it's really important to find a personal connection to your topic. The kernel of every successful OO is a story that you want to tell. And sometimes these stories are very personal. Like for J.J. Kapoor, it was clearly the story of his father being conflated with Osama bin Laden and his temple being attacked. But the stories can also be a bit more abstract. For Ashwin Pillai, for instance, who gave the speech on the way in which we crave or desire to have the meaning and purpose of our lives handed to us, he's a student who loved philosophy, and he studied it on his own, and he was drawn to stories about finding philosophical meaning. And so he found a topic that was very personal to him. As he was on this journey of trying to find meaning and reading philosophers, he thought, how does this mindset actually play out in everyday society? And he was able to find a topic that was really personal to him, our desire to find purpose and meaning. So that was a much more abstract story. So whether your story starts off as something very personal or maybe a more concrete problem, I know that Will Florentino last year, our original oratory captain this year, he really wanted to tell a story or to talk about the problems of gun control and why some people are so resistant to gun control. And also he knew he wanted to talk about his grandfather passing away. Those two issues seemed so opposite, but by starting with those two stories, he was able to actually pinpoint a mindset that united them. Our fear of the unknown, our fear of the dark. My second piece of advice is to then start researching. Once you have that list of the problems and stories that you want to tell, then start researching broader mindsets or attitudes or values that lead to the problems that you've outlined. The goal is to find typically a long-form article or an entire book that goes much deeper than daily news coverage and provides a robust and extensive explanation for a mindset or set of values that help to explain broader phenomenon. Mindsets and values will always help to explain the root causes of concrete problems, but it's harder to find those articles. So the best way to do that type of research is to read publications that do longer form journalism like The Atlantic or The New Yorker. Another good place to look is podcasts. Two that I especially like for searching for OO topics would be This American Life and TED Radio Hour. Another way you could do it is to watch documentaries that tackle social issues. And a final way is to look at books that talk about mindsets, psychology, culture, or values. Especially psychology books oftentimes can be really good for finding mindsets. So let's look at some examples. The first one is an Atlantic article, which is called Workism is Making Americans Miserable. This article discusses the ways that American society has turned work into a new religion, one where we worship work as a way to give our lives meaning. So just notice right off the bat how these articles that I'm about to show you are long form. They're clearly longer and more in depth than the news articles that are just reporting on daily events. In general, these long form articles develop arguments about ideas as opposed to just reporting on facts. And so the argument of this article, if you scroll down, you'll see under this first header, says the decline of traditional faith in America has coincided with an explosion of new atheisms. Some people worship beauty, some worship political identities, and others worship their children. But everybody worships something, and workism is among the most potent of the new religions competing for congregants. What is workism? It's the belief that work is not only necessary to economic production, but also the centerpiece of one's identity and life's purpose, and the belief that any policy to promote human welfare must always encourage more work. So notice, right from this example, you have a great definition of a mindset, workism. Instead of just viewing a job, as something that needs to get done, we have made work the center of our identity and life's purpose. And this article goes on to talk about how that mindset is actually making us miserable. So that could be the kernel of a really powerful original oratory that talks about our mindset of wanting to work more and more and more. Another example I got from a podcast on This American Life, which was called Tell Me I'm Fat. And this brought up issues surrounding mental health and weight that we don't normally think about. People talk about being overweight as an epidemic in American society, almost as if it's a disease, as if fat people have no willpower and are weak and are a drain on our healthcare system. You'll notice that oftentimes in these seemingly objective articles about the dangers of the obesity epidemic in America, there's almost a lot of blaming that goes on in terms of obese people. And this podcast gives voice to the impact that these narratives or this rhetoric has on people who are overweight. And the most dramatic one, there were a couple good stories in this one. One was about somebody who decided to come out as being fat, which seems strange, but she talks about the way in which being fat weighed on her so heavily, and she had tried so many different ways to lose weight that it always felt like an elephant in the room. So she just started embracing the fact that she was overweight. And the most dramatic story within this podcast was about someone who realized all the privileges that come with being skinny. She wasn't getting jobs within the film industry. She wasn't really treated seriously within her work environment. And so she got herself addicted to weight loss dieting pills that was functionally a form of speed, a really dangerous drug, in order to no longer be fat. She ended up getting skinny and realized that all of these problems within her life were instantly solved. People started valuing her more. People started taking her seriously at work. And she has continued to keep herself addicted to pills so that she can reap these privileges. And so those stories within This American Life, yes, they aren't taking a big, broad form, but they were able to articulate very serious problems about the mindset that we have or the attitudes that we have towards people who are overweight or people who are fat. So I found those stories really compelling, and one of those could be a kernel for a good OO. Another really powerful article I found came from The Intelligencer, and it's called The Poison We Pick. And it was a really long-form article. I mean, this one is exceptionally long, but really good. And it pinpoints the ways that large shifts in American society that have undermined traditional institutions that used to provide meaning, like religion, and the loss of a sense of community that used to exist has actually been propelling people to turn towards opioids, which is functionally a form of heroin to numb that pain. And there's a lot of good stuff in this article. I really recommend reading all of it so that you get a much better sense of the types of articles that I think yield good OO topics as opposed to just like CNN or Fox News articles. Let's look at some excerpts here. And I'm going to read some of these paragraphs. I know they're a little long, but I think this article does a really good job of developing larger trends that lead to shifts in attitudes and mindsets that are problematic. So it says here, market capitalism and revolutionary technology in the past couple of decades have transformed our economic and cultural reality, most intensely for those without college degrees. The dignity that many working class men retain by providing for their families through physical labor has been reduced by automation. Stable family life has collapsed, and the number of children without two parents in the home has risen among the white working and middle classes. The internet has ravaged local retail stores, flattening the uniqueness of many communities. Smartphones have eviscerated those moments of actual human interaction. Meaning, once effortlessly provided by a more unified and often religious culture shared, at least nominally by others, is harder to find, and the proportion of Americans who identify as nuns, with no religious affiliation, has risen to record levels. Even as we near peak employment and record-high median household income, a sense of permanent economic insecurity and spiritual emptiness has become widespread. And some of that emptiness was once assuaged by a constantly rising standard of living generation to generation, but that has now evaporated for most Americans. So you can see from that paragraph, it's really talking about big changes to American society that have led to a sense of spiritual emptiness. So this could be a speech perhaps about the dangers of embracing progress and transformation in society. Look at this next excerpt. The pace of change, the ethos of individualism, the relentless dehumanization that capitalism abets, the constant moving and disruption combined with a relatively small government and the absence of official religion risked the construction of an overly atomized society, where everyone has to create his or her own meaning and everyone feels alone. The American project always left an empty center of collective meaning, but for a long time Americans filled it with their own extraordinary work ethic, an unprecedented web of associations and clubs and communal or ethnic ties far surpassing Europe's, and such a plethora of religious options that almost no one was left without a purpose or some kind of easily available meaning to their lives. Now let's skip down a little further. What has happened in the past few decades is an accelerated waning of all those traditional American supports for a meaningful collective life and their replacement with various forms of cheap distraction. Addiction to work, to food, to phones, to TV, to video games, to porn, to news, and to drugs is all around us. The core habit of bourgeois life, deferred gratification, has lost its grip on the American soul. We seek the instant, easy highs, and it's hard not to see this as the broader context for the opioid wave. This was not originally a conscious choice for most of those caught up in it. Most were introduced to the poppy's joys by their own family members and friends. The last link in a chain that included the medical establishment and began with the pharmaceutical companies. It may be best to think of this wave, therefore, not as a function of miserable people turning to drugs en masse, but of those people who didn't realize how miserable they were until they found out what life without misery could be. To return to their previous lives became unthinkable. For many, it still is. If Marx posited that religion is the opiate of the people, then we have reached a new, more clarifying moment in the history of the West. Opiates are now the religion of the people. So you can see here, this is an article that Ashwin Pillai used in his speech about trying to find meaning in one's life. This article does a great job of articulating a mindset about the dangers of our American work ethic and individualism that has led us to complete isolation and spiritual emptiness as those senses of community have broken apart and as we've become more isolated and spiritually empty. And that in a desire to fill that void of the meaning of our lives, opiates actually provide a really good way to numb that pain. So you can see this is an article that's doing a really good job of taking a much bigger bird's eye view of the situation in America instead of just reporting on the newest trend in terms of what's going on with pharmaceutical companies or addiction rates. It's really going deep to develop root causes of what's going on. So those are the types of articles you're looking for. And finally, a good book that I want to talk about is Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. And this is a book that you've probably seen in bookstores. It's all about making us aware of our complex psychological processes that make us prone to making errors. Why do you procrastinate? Why are you lazy in certain situations? Why do you act up in other ways? And the focus on this book is about the two systems that dictate our thoughts and decisions. And the author argues that our brains are comprised of two characters. One that thinks fast, which is system 1, and one that thinks slow, which is system 2. And he says that system 1 operates automatically, intuitively, involuntarily, and effortlessly. It's things you do without thinking about, like when we drive, or when you notice someone has an angry facial expression, or you recall your age. Those are not things you have to think hard about, right? They're automatic. And system 2 requires slowing down, deliberating, solving problems, reasoning, computing, focusing, concentrating, considering other data, and not jumping to quick conclusions. Like when you have to do your math homework and calculate a problem, or when you're choosing where to invest money, or if you're filling out a complicated form, or you're trying to develop an original oratory topic. And as you can guess, these two systems like to fight against each other. Your inclination, sorry to reveal to you, is towards system number 1. You want to do things that are easy and automatic. You want to avoid hard thinking. But guess what? Most of the problems in your life actually stem from avoiding system number 2. And so this book goes into all kinds of problems that are developed because of the way that our minds are always kind of tricking us into going towards the routine system as opposed to going to the complicated system number 2. And so within that book, you'd find lots of good mindsets that explain why we do things like stereotype people or why we procrastinate, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully these types of examples of longer form articles and books and podcasts help to give you ideas about the types of things that you should be looking for. I know that it's going to be hard. Continue to be patient. Do these assignments that I'm talking about, and I know that even if you don't feel satisfied right away, you'll be on track to eventually developing a good topic. As always, if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me.